All right, we're continuing on with our topic of responding to antigens, and like I said, this is quite a big topic. So in the last lesson, we looked at antigens being those markers that are found on cells and on pathogens that interact with our immune system. And then we looked at examples of pathogens and classified them as being either cellular or non-cellular pathogens. So things like bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa. What we're going to look at today is quite a small section, but it's important to kind of finish off these 2 points. And it's looking at the preventative strategies that basically stop pathogens from entering organisms. The rest of this topic we'll probably spend a couple of weeks on getting through this and this because there's a lot to it, okay? But I just want us to have our heads around pathogens as being things that can cause disease, antigens as being the part of a pathogen that our immune system recognizes, or a part of our own body that the immune system recognizes as being ourselves, and then also what stops pathogens getting into our bodies in the first place. I think it's really important to just go over this quickly. It's not in the study design, so I don't want you spending a huge amount of time trying to memorize each of these. But I think if we're looking at the immune system and how disease occurs and how our bodies respond, I think it's really important to have your head around how pathogens are transmitted. So how do they pass from person to person or, through the atmosphere sometimes. So you could pause here and have a quick think of different ways that pathogens move around. Okay, we have what's called direct physical contact. So this is if someone is infected with a pathogen. Let's just say, for example, we're looking at either viruses or bacteria. Some modes of transmission are more common for certain types of pathogen. So direct physical contact would be touching a person that is infected, okay? And that includes sexual contact. So obviously sexually transmissible infections are the transmitting of pathogens through sexual contact. We can also have indirect physical contact. And this is when you don't touch a person that is infected, but that person might touch, say, a table, and then you touch that table. So without directly touching that person, you have picked up that pathogen that they have left around. And you will have heard of, this being a potential risk with coronavirus. That's why it's really important that people are washing their hands and that things like doorknobs and things that people touch quite often are washed frequently because it can survive on those surfaces for several hours and up to days. Droplet contact. Again, this is the big one with coronavirus. As I said, it's different for each type of pathogen. So this is when, let's say you've got a little virus, a little virus particle. And remember, these are absolutely tiny. There's no possible way you would ever see one. And it's being carried or transported in these tiny little droplets kind of spit, really. Again, that you can't see, they're so small, but your body produces these droplets, and if someone coughs or sneezes, those droplets are actually passing that virus around. So that's a really big one with things like influenza and coronavirus. Airborne transmission is a bit different. This is when the microorganism, so the virus or the bacteria, can just remain in the air. So it can move through the air on its own. It doesn't need that droplet. So that can obviously be quite dangerous because it doesn't rely on people coming into contact with each other. It just means that certain pathogens are able to survive in the air. Water contamination, so if water has pathogens in it, and again, certain pathogens love water environments. Cholera is a big example. That was a huge infectious disease around 100 years ago, and still common in a lot of areas. So unsafe, unclean water. food contamination, so through uncooked or unsafe food, or through people not washing hands properly and pathogens getting passed around. And vector transmission. A vector is basically something that carries a pathogen around, okay? And the most common example would be mosquitoes. So you might have heard of malaria or things like dengue fever. So they're actually caused by protozoa that are carried around by mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are actually the most dangerous animal in the world. They're responsible for tens of millions of deaths every year from transporting these diseases. Okay, like I said, I think it's a good idea to have your head around how these pathogens get passed around. So when we look now at how our body stops them from getting in, it makes a bit more sense. Okay, I do want you to dedicate probably, half a page in your notes on this brief summary of everything we're going to look at over the next 2 weeks. I think it's really important to be able to refer back to see what we are looking at. So, the immune system. It's often referred to as having these 3 lines of defense. What we're talking about here is kind of 3 steps of immunity. You'll notice there's a few terms, and it's really important that you know these. So I've got all the really important terms on this slide. So we've got what's called the innate or non-specific immune system. And as we go through this over the next 2 weeks, these terms will make a bit more sense. But basically, if something is innate, it's something that you're born with. Okay, so you might hear of someone say, someone's got an innate sense of style, and it's basically saying, they're born that way. So innate is something you're born with. You don't have to develop it, and it is non-specific. Then there is also the adaptive, so something that has to develop, or specific immune system. And we won't get to looking at that until at least a week, okay? But have it in this little summary. Okay, so our 3 lines of defense. We have the first line of defense, the second line of defense, and the third line of defense. And you'll notice that the textbook uses these terms, but it's important that you know that the first line of defense is part of the innate or non-specific immune system. The second line of defense is innate or non-specific. The third line of defense is the adaptive or specific immune system. The first line of defense, which is what we're going to look at today, is really just looking at barriers. These are things that prevent pathogens entering the organism. Okay, so things that stop pathogens getting into our body in the first place. And 99.99999% of the time, these barriers are effective, which is why we're not sick all the time. Okay, so there's pathogens around us constantly. The reason we are not sick all the time is because our first line of defense is doing its job and pathogens aren't getting in. Okay, if pathogens do get in, we move to the second line of defense. Okay, this involves a variety of cells and molecules, and their job is to destroy pathogens that have entered the body. Okay, so the first line of defense has been breached, and now we try to destroy those pathogens. The aim of this is to prevent the pathogen spreading within the body. So pathogens will always enter the body in one place. Okay, and we'll look at that in a minute, but they don't just enter every part of your body at once. They enter at one place, and the aim of this is to stop it spreading to the rest of the body. This is important, and we'll look at this more next week. The second line of defense responds in the same way to all pathogens. And this is what we mean when we say it is non-specific. So it doesn't matter if it's the influenza virus or if it's chlamydia, or if it's Ebola. It will only respond in the same way. And we'll look more at that later. Don't worry too much about that for now. Okay, and then we have the third line of defense, which really is kind of the ramped up version that is required to fully destroy the pathogen. So while the second line of defense is to kind of stop it spreading and getting worse, you still need that third line of defense to actually destroy the pathogens completely. This involves specialized immune cells. It has specific responses for specific pathogens. Okay, so again, thinking back to my example, the cells that would respond to influenza would be different to those that respond to chlamydia. Okay, so it would have a specific response depending on the pathogen. And there's two components to it. Again, just write this down for now. Don't worry too much about it. But we have what's called the humoral and the cell-mediated responses. Okay, so remembering this is our specific response. So just have this in your notes so you can refer back to it as we go along this topic. This is my really lame analogy, but I think it might help some people. If you don't know Game of Thrones, it probably won't help you at all, and you might want to skip this section. Or if you do love Game of Thrones, and let's say you're like halfway through season 5 and don't know what happens at the end, you also might want to skip this. So, if we think of the Night King as being our pathogen, okay, so it's the baddie that's trying to get into our body and kill us, okay? There was a wall. Okay, it was a barrier that was literally to stop the Night King entering Westeros, which is our body. Okay, it was a barrier for thousands of years. It worked. The pathogen, the Night King, couldn't get in. Okay, it was doing its job. And then he got himself a dragon and he breached the barrier. Okay, he burnt down the wall and now the pathogen has entered the body. The Night King is in Westeros, okay? So we have a general response, which is our second line of defense, okay? And that was like just that general battle, okay? All of the soldiers around Westeros came together to fight all of the White Walkers as best as they could, but it wasn't something that was targeted to the Night King in particular. It was just to try and stop the White Walkers getting any further. Okay, it's our general, non-specific response. And that's working, it's keeping them in one place, but we still need a specialized response. And this is where you should definitely pause if you're quite invested in Game of Thrones, but somehow haven't found the time to watch it because you're so busy studying for your VCE. We've got Arya. And she's badass and she comes in and she kills the Night King. She is a specialized warrior that can kill him. It is our third line of defense. And because she has wiped him out, that destroys that entire army. Okay, so that was our third line of defense. So some people actually find it helpful to have a little analogy that helps them remember those 3 lines of defense. Okay, you just need to have some notes on this. A lot of these will probably make sense. Some of these are probably new terms, but we're just going to look at the barriers in animals and then those in plants. Okay, I think a table is a good way to do this. In animals and obviously in humans, we have 3 types of barriers: physical barriers, chemical barriers, and microbiological barriers. So we'll go through these one by one. Physical barriers are things that basically block or stop pathogens entering the organism. So if you think about your own body, you could probably think of some obvious examples of this. The major one is our skin. Okay, the skin is actually kind of our most important immune organ. It stops most pathogens entering our body. Things like the lining inside the respiratory and digestive tracts. So if you think about it, technically there's nothing between the outer environment and the inside of your lungs. You know, that's a tube airway. So the lining in there is what stops things going into your blood and your tissue. Cilia, these are kind of like tiny hair-like projections. So they're not actually hair, but they're tiny, tiny folds, about the same size of hairs, particularly in your airways, so in your nose and then down into the trachea. And they're the things that, you know, if you're in a dusty environment and you sneeze, that's because the cilia have reacted to something in the air and you sneeze, and that is to try and get that pathogen out of your body. Okay, eyelashes are another example. Even all the small hairs on your body are to stop pathogens entering. Okay, so they're physical things, they physically stop pathogens getting into your body. There's chemical barriers, which are chemical substances, and rather than just stopping something entering, their job is to actually destroy pathogens. Okay, so some examples are the enzymes in our tears. Okay, again, if you've been in like a dusty environment and your eyes start watering, that's because your body is sensing things that are causing sensitivity, and those tears are to try and stop things getting into your body. Stomach acid is another one. You might think, well, your stomach, you know, something's in your stomach, it's already gotten through the barrier. Not technically. Again, your stomach is just kind of a pit, really. Things aren't in your body until they have been absorbed by the bloodstream or absorbed by the tissues. So stomach acid kind of destroys things that shouldn't be in there. So if you eat some dodgy food, often your stomach acid will destroy that before you get sick. Similarly, we've got acid in our sweat, which destroys pathogens. There are compounds so antibacterials, they destroy bacteria that are found in earwax and also in semen. The earwax one is an important one because obviously a lot of people kind of clean their ears out really, really thoroughly, but earwax is a really important protection that stops you getting ear infections, and at the very worst case scenario, bacteria being able to get close to your brain. And also things like pH changes. So certain pathogens, like everything, they have ideal acidity and pH conditions. So pH changes in places like the vagina, in the stomach, they are all protective barriers. And finally, microbiological barriers. So if you think about this term, we're talking about tiny living things. Ooh, what tiny living things are in our bodies? Hey? These are our good bacteria, okay? And I do really want you to jump in and watch this YouTube video in a minute. It's really interesting. But basically, we have more good bacteria in our bodies than we have of our own body cells, okay? And you've probably heard on ads for like yogurt and things like that talking about beneficial bacteria. These are so important in protecting us. They prevent the growth of bad bacteria, so pathogens. So these are the bad bacteria. So basically the good bacteria that protect us from the bad bacteria. And another word for this is flora, which is also what we call flower. And it's often because, you know, on microscopic images, beneficial bacteria kind of form these patterns that almost look like a growth of flowers. Okay, so we've got this microflora on our skin. This is basically, we get it when we're first born, and that kind of comes through the birth canal. Again, in that video, it doesn't show anything graphic, but it explains that babies that are born through cesarean often don't have as many protective bacteria at birth because they don't go through the birth canal, which is where those bacteria are picked up and then they live on your skin for the rest of your life and protect you. we've got huge amounts of these in our gut as well, and they're really, really important for protecting us. The ways they protect us, if you remember, obviously bacteria are these, unicellular prokaryotic organisms that are living in our bodies. They do two things. Firstly, they take up space. If we've got heaps of these good bacteria that don't cause us any harm, there's less space for bad bacteria to settle down and start reproducing and forming colonies. And also they compete for resources. So things like the small amounts of oxygen or maybe glucose or things that they need from our body, those good bacteria are using them all, the bad bacteria can't. Okay, so please do jump in and watch the video. It goes for about 5 or 6 minutes, but it is really cool, and it talks a lot about how the bacteria in your gut play a really big role in brain function. It's a really interesting new area of research. Okay, so if you're a visual learner, you might want to have a picture like this in your notes. So things like we talked about the enzymes in our tears. We've got the cilia in our nose. We've got the trachea, so that lining in that tract. We'd have things like our earwax, skin, the stomach acid, and that will be found all the way through our digestive tract. We'd have our microflora here, so those good bacteria in the gut, and then we'd have things like our pH changes through the gastrointestinal system, even things as well like urine. So when urine is flushed out, that provides protection as well. Okay, and the final thing we're going to look at is the barriers in plants. It's a really small part of the study design, but there have been questions that come up, so it's worth having these notes on plants as well. In general, when we look at the immune system, it's looking at animals and humans, but it can come up in plants as well. In plants, we just have the physical and chemical barriers. So again, physical barriers are blocking pathogens entering the plant. Chemical barriers are chemicals that are harmful to pathogens. So same idea as in animals. Some of these chemicals also stop insects and animals. So they're a general protection for the plant. And often with plants, insects or animals are what carry disease to plants. So physical things, things like the waxy part on leaves, so it stops things entering, having a thick protective bark, formation of galls, which is basically abnormal outgrowths of plant tissue. And if you've ever kind of seen trees or leaves that have these kind of knobbly bits on them, they are galls. We talked about stomata. They're the little holes on leaves. If you've got a leaf, ferns are a really good example of this. If you ever see ferns, there's heaps out in the Dandenongs. If you look underneath the leaf, you see these beautiful patterns. They're those tiny little pores that are really important for allowing carbon dioxide to diffuse in for photosynthesis, but they can be opened and closed. So obviously, if they're closed, it makes it hard for pathogens to enter. And things like thorns and trichomes, which are like those tiny little hairs that you see on leaves. Okay, so there are the physical things that protect plants. Chemicals, there's a variety of different enzymes that can destroy pathogens. There's a thing called oxalic acid, which is a toxic substance that plants release that destroy pathogens. And plants also produce compounds called phenols. And these are basically secreted when a plant is wounded. So let's say a leaf is broken or something like that. They will then secrete this compound that would repel microorganisms because these barriers have been breached. Okay, so you can see things like these galls, which are the growths on the bark there, the kind of waxy cuticles on the leaves. Got some thorns here which make it hard for things like insects and animals to access the plant and carry disease. These stomata close up those little holes, and even things like the nice thick protection of bark. Okay, there's a good diagram of this on page 312 of the textbook. If you fancy doing a bit of drawing, and that's going to help you remember these, that's great. Okay, so we'll leave it there today. We've covered the different types of pathogens that can cause disease and the barriers that protect animals and plants from these pathogens. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to move on to these. Okay, there's a fair bit in it, but we've got a bit of time, so we'll take it nice and slow and just kind of cover one main component at a time. All right, see you next week.